My guest tonight is Mark Weber. Mark is an American historian, author, lecturer, and current affairs analyst. He is also director of the Institute for Historical Review, an independent public interest education center in Southern California that works to promote peace, understanding, and justice through greater public awareness of the past. In particular, the IHR strives to increase understanding of the causes, nature, and consequences of war and conflict. I guess it's fair to say the Institute there is dedicated to revisionism or revisionist history. Is that correct, Mark?
Well, I want to mention how revisionism, I think, is simply a historical perspective that's not the official one. Mm-hmm. That's the shorthand version of what revisionism is. I like to think, of course, all good history is revisionist in the sense that it takes into account new evidence, new insights, and that so all good history is revisionist. Unfortunately, very often the word revisionist is thrown around to, especially by people who embrace, you might say, the official or prevailing view of whatever subject is being talked about, to mean distorted history or wrong-headed history. And so the word revisionist is already a loaded term depending on who's using it. But I use it, and I think it should be used to mean history that's, as Harry Elmer Barnes says, in accord with the facts. Now, people, of course, debate about that, and that there's no, I don't want to be dogmatic about it, but one should always be skeptical, I think, of an official view of history, because how history is looked at in every society, in any society, is always going to reflect the agenda, the interests, the outlook of those who have power in society. And that's the way it always has been. That's the way it always will be. And it's especially an important issue, I think, in America today, because we're seeing such dramatic changes in how we're supposed to look at history. I mean, one good example is the big debate that's going on about Columbus Day. Columbus Day was introduced at the end of the 19th century to especially as a kind of a sop to Italian Americans, and it was considered a very great a time to remember the founding of or the discovery of North America by Europeans. And now many communities and even states or cities denigrate Columbus Day and have substituted for it something they call Indigenous Peoples Day, because they consider, understandably, of course, from a certain point of view, arrogant to honor what amounts to the takeover and dispossession of the natives of North America. But simply the point is, though, that this is a good example of how our perspective on a day that in many places was an official holiday, Columbus Day, has been changed even within our own recent history here in the United States.
Yes, I think it was Napoleon Bonaparte that said history is the version of past events that people have decided to agree upon. So, and it was, I think Henry Ford more laconically said, history is bunk. Now,
well, I wouldn't put it that way. I mean, I think history is not. I mean, what he means by that, yes, of course, is that oftentimes it's very simplistic, and of course, it's going to represent the outlook of those people who have power. Mm-hmm. I have a pretty good collection of American history textbooks, and I'm very interested in comparing how history is, how our perception of history has changed in these textbooks, which are used in high schools in the United States and have been for the past 60, 70, 80 years, and how key events and the general trajectory of American history has changed over that period of time to reflect the cultural changes and shifts that have taken place in American society over that time.
Now, on your website, the IHR website, you have an essay written by Harry Elmer Barnes, Revisionism and the Promotion of Peace, and I highly recommend that essay because it kind of broadly covers, I would say, kind of the mission of IHR and maybe some other places that are dedicated to at least revisionist or more critical view of history.
Yes, yes, of course. It's on our website on the homepage, mm-hmm, precisely because I think it is a very succinct but also very well presented summary of, I think, of why a critical, intelligent, informed view of history, one that is skeptical of the official prevailing one, is important, just on the basis that very often an interpretation of history is promoted by those people who cite it to promote war and conflict, and we've seen this happen over and over and over. I'm a person who grew up in the 1960s, and the major issue of my youth, of course, was the Vietnam War. And repeatedly, continually, President Johnson justified the U.S. involvement in Vietnam by citing World War II. And I accepted, like most Americans, his premise, which now I don't believe, that World War II was absolutely necessary. And Lyndon Johnson promoted this comparison, made this comparison over and over with World War II, feeling with confidence that the American public would accept his premise as a justification for the calamitous, disastrous U.S. involvement in Vietnam during the 1960s. And that was already a very important thing even at that time. Since that time, of course, and I hope many other people, have come to have a much more skeptical view of this official prevailing view about World War II. But it's certainly a minority, because that basic view of World War II as a necessary, unavoidable, morally righteous conflict, which Lyndon Johnson promoted, is still promoted by American politicians and in our media and in our classrooms, even perhaps more emphatically than it was during the 1960s. And it's used and cited by people who, for their own reasons, for their own interests, promote war, promote U.S. military involvement overseas for that reason.
Now, you cover that rather well in your essay, The Good War Myth of World War II. And that's the primary point of our discussion tonight. And what I want to ask you that is, what are the biggest myths to emerge from the conflagration, and how do they affect us today? The good war, the big one.
Yeah, I'd say the number one and most dangerous myth is that World War II was a morally righteous war, that whatever disagreements people might have about the justice or the righteousness of the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, or the Vietnam War, or World War I, or the Civil War, we're told over and over again that the one war that was unquestionably the so-called good war, the morally righteous, indisputably necessary war, was World War II. And my main point is to show that that's not only not accurate, it's a very dangerous myth. It completely distorts, I think, the reality of the Second World War, but it's an understandable one, because how we view World War II is especially now tied up so much with America's idea of itself, and is very much in keeping with the agenda and the outlook of those who have power in our society.
Now, so yeah, we see it was told us it was the good war. America's, I guess, vision of itself as the crusader state, the liberating nation, going abroad, destroying monsters. That conflicted very much with the traditional idea of America, as John Quincy Adams laid out in the 1820s, where America was told not to go abroad in search of monsters to destroy, and to freedom abroad had America's benedictions, but America was not going to be the vindicator of freedom abroad, because if we did, we would we'd be overwhelmed by the entangling alliances that such a mission would entail. So
right.
From George Washington up until, I guess you could say arguably up until, well, probably Woodrow Wilson, but you could also make the case against the Spanish-American War, but that was a little different. It wasn't. I guess you could say the Spanish-American War was when America went after the Spanish Empire and in search of her possessions in the Caribbean and the Pacific. But the big myth of that, first of all, World War II. Obviously, we can't discuss World War II unless we talk about the Great War, it was called the Great War then, but World War I, and the conflicts and disputes that emerged from that war. What was the big problem with the peace in 1919?
Well, yes, as you say, of course, looking at World War II cannot be done in any clear-headed way without understanding the First World War. I put a lot of focus on, in that essay that you cited and elsewhere, not just on the war itself, but on America's role in the war. Because in each case, in the First World War and in the Second World War, the United States easily could have stayed out of the conflict. Remember, in the 18th and 19th centuries, there were great wars raging in Europe, and American political leaders generally took the view that Washington and Jefferson and most Americans had at the beginning of the United States, that those are not our wars and that we should stay out of them. That changed during the, a big shift happened during the Spanish-American War, but really in a very major, decisive way with the First World War. So I'm not really focusing on the conflict or the way in which each of those wars began. The big point I try to emphasize for America is the American role in each of those wars. The United States declared war on Germany in April 1917. Historians are pretty unanimous now, I think, in taking the view that the United States easily could have stayed out of that. There were no essential American interests involved. But there were some interests, economic business interests, in going to war on the side of the Allies. There was also some, you might say, sentimental ties that many Americans at that time, the WASP establishment, had with Britain. But it particularly reflected the messianic, crusader, good guy versus bad guy outlook of Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson his father was a Presbyterian minister. His mother was the daughter of a Presbyterian minister. He had this very righteous, I would say self-righteous view of America's role in the world as going out to fight for this new order that was going to transform not merely the world, but even human beings. And he proclaimed that when he took the United States and asked Congress for a declaration of war in 1917, that this was a war in which the United States had no interest except to make the world safe for democracy and to bring in a new order that was going to end war forever. These are utopian, absolutely crazy ideas, really, about the role of the United States or any country in the world. Of course, the United States would resent it mightily if another country were to go around throwing around its power, claiming that level of self-righteousness that the United States had in World War I. But one of the big points is that the American public was so dissatisfied by the reality that came out of its role in the First World War that there was a big reaction against Woodrow Wilson's brand of idealism in the 1920s and a determination by most Americans not to get suckered into something like that again. That was the very, very strong feeling, especially because the documents that were made public at the end of the First World War showed that the British and the French are supposedly noble allies, were every bit as eager to grab as much territory as they could, that they had their own selfish and partisan interests in fighting the war, did not share this big idealistic view of the United States, certainly not in reality, that Americans were really pretty disgusted. They were also disgusted by the hypocrisy of the United States and the Allies. I mean, there's many examples of this. The United States supposedly was fighting for self-determination of peoples, but it violated it not just for the Germans, for the defeated, which the United States and Woodrow Wilson said was not going to be the case, but even for others. For example, Wilson carefully avoided giving any support for self-determination of the Irish, who at that time were, of course, part of the United Kingdom, and of other peoples in Europe as well. There's many examples of that. In other words, the reality after the end of the First World War was a very sordid one, and Americans were disgusted by that. So it took a lot of propaganda. It took a lot of lies by Franklin Roosevelt to try to convince Americans to go and do much the same thing they did in the First World War, do it again. That is to go to war in a conflict that the United States, its best interests were served by staying out of the conflict. And so not just is it important to look at the First World War in terms of how the conflict began, but I'm especially interested at this point here, and of course in this essay that you referred to, in discussing the American involvement and the American perspective on that.
And it's also interesting to point out that in Versailles, wasn't Ho Chi Minh present, where he requested for Vietnamese independence from the French Empire?
Ho Chi Minh was one of many people who were in Paris, and they wanted the Allies, who had made these high, noble-sounding promises, to get a hearing for independence for the Vietnamese. But he wasn't even given a hearing. He wasn't even given a chance to present his case. Other people were at least listened to and ignored or rebuffed. But Ho Chi Minh, representing the Vietnamese, wasn't even given a hearing. I mean, it wasn't merely that the people who were under colonial rule of the French, in that case, or the British, were ignored, and the pledge for self-determination was betrayed or rebuffed. But even people who had been under the rule of the Central Powers, that is, of the Ottoman Empire, even they were rebuffed. And specifically, the Allies, the British and the French, had given conflicting promises to the Arabs. They promised the Arabs, on the one hand, that they would be given their independence and freedom if they agreed to fight with the British and French against the Ottoman Turks who controlled much of the Arab world. At the same time, the British and the French were divvying up in secret the Arab countries between themselves. And then the British and the Americans made a pledge to give Palestine to the Zionist Jews. So it was a kind of a double cross, you might say. And all that came out, you see, at the end of the war, and the American public was pretty strongly just repelled and put off by this obvious deceit, betrayal, hypocrisy.
And the Balfour Declaration was given to the Jews with the expectation that, I guess, the Jewish lobby in America would help secure America's entry into the war, correct?
Yes, that was an important motive, was to secure, because at the beginning of the war, most Jews around the world supported the Central Powers, that is, Germany and its allies. And the reason for that is that the country that most Jews despised the strongest, disliked the most, was Tsarist Russia. Mm-hmm. And because in Tsarist Russia, Jews weren't even, with some exceptions, weren't even allowed to live in most of Russia. The country was, Jews were very markedly second-class citizens in that country. And in Germany, Jews were very successful. They were rich, they were prosperous, and so most Jews sympathized much more with Germany. Now, that changed in February 1917. The Tsar was overthrown, provisional government came in, but to help secure this support among Jews in Britain and the United States for the war, the Balfour Declaration was issued as an important motivation for that was exactly that. Again, the Balfour Declaration is a very deceitful document. It's carefully phrased in such a way as to seem to promise to the Jews a Jewish state without exactly saying that. It just calls it a Jewish homeland in Palestine. It's unclear if that means some reservation in Palestine. It's unclear whether it means Jews get to take over all of Palestine. And again, it conflicts with promises that the Allies had made to the Arabs that they would be given self-determination, independence, if they supported the United States and Britain and France during the First World War. And of course, that was betrayed. But that just as one example, there's many others. I mean, for example, the Germans had a concession or a control over part of China, the Shandong Peninsula. And at the end of the war, instead of giving the Shandong Peninsula to China, the population, of course, was overwhelmingly Chinese. It was a concession, something like the British had Hong Kong, something like that. Well, they gave it to the Japanese. Well, the Chinese, of course, felt utterly betrayed. This was a slap in the face to them because, but Japan had been an ally in the First World War, and it wanted to increase its empire. But see, all this was in such marked contrast to the noble principles that Americans were told they were fighting for, that there was this huge disgust. So that's why the Neutrality Acts were passed during the 1930s, early 1930s, to make sure the United States wasn't sucked again into another conflict in Europe as it had been in the First World War.
Of course, war changes things. Domestically, the Wilson administration, upon receiving a declaration of war, moved to get some tyrannical legislation passed through the Congress. You had the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act, which pretty much suspended the Constitution for the duration of the war. You were not free to criticize the war or the government pretty much during the war. I think Eugene Debs was put in prison for over. He was, sentenced for 20 years in prison for criticizing the war. And you also had the imposition of conscription, which was very controversial at the time because Americans were not used to being drafted into the military to fight a foreign war.
Right. That's after the United States got into the war. It began spying and suppressing things and so forth. But see, a very important aspect is that as soon as the war began, the Central Powers, of course, were cut off by the oceans. So big business and banks began lending money and supplying huge amounts of military and other supplies to Britain and France, but especially to Britain. And this gave increasingly, from 1914, 15, 16 into 17, a big incentive to very important business interests in the United States to make sure the Allies won because they wanted to be paid for all of this. And also the economy was revived in America because of these huge war contracts with Britain and France. So there was a strong business economic incentive for the United States, of course, to side with the Allies because of the geographical nature of the things. Germany, of course, had no real trade. It was cut off. In fact, the British imposed a blockade on Germany to try to starve the population of Germany. But see, so it's very often the case, of course, where the business interests just happen to coincide with these policies that are given high-sounding, noble names and purpose, but they just happen to coincide also with economic interests.
Mm-hmm. And that's basically what happened was you could say the House of Morgan. The Wall Street interests wanted the U.S. government to socialize their risk and privatize their profits by drawing the country into the war.
Right. It wasn't just the House of Morgan. Those are important banking interests, but also many, of course, manufacturers and so forth were supplying. Don't realize this, but it was a very amazing thing that the Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, Secretary of State publicly resigned out of disgust with the clear lack of neutrality, the betrayal of the United States up until April 1917 was supposedly a neutral country, but the policies of the United States were very unneutral. They were very much in favor of the Allies. And of course, economically, it was the United States was lending money to the British and the French. They were supplying with military supplies. And William Jennings Bryan was so disgusted by this, he resigned. Now, that's a remarkable thing. In our time, there are very few American leaders of that high a level who will resign their position on a matter of principle. You'll find sometimes lower level people, ambassadors or assistant secretaries or undersecretaries might resign their position, but it's very rare for an official, a cabinet level official in the American government to end his or hurt his political career by doing something out of principle, as William Jennings Bryan did in 1916.
Mm-hmm. And you had the steel and the so-called powder trust and all these industrial and interests. They were making money hand over fist in the war.
In 1930, there were a series of hearings, investigations in the Congress, headed by Senator Nye from North Dakota, the so-called Nye Commission hearings, the Nye investigations, NYE was his name. And they established very authoritatively, I think, just how strong the economic and business motives were of many important American corporations and banks to side with the Allies during the First World War. And it was out of those hearings, by the way, that came explicitly the Neutrality Acts, mm-hmm. which then Franklin Roosevelt subverted and overturned.
These were the so-called merchants of death.
Right, that's right. The Nye hearings were, and of course, the media will give it a spin, but the merchants of death was a big point. And again, you have to remember even the culture of America was very, very hostile to this war that Wilson had gotten us into in 1917-18, with thousands, of course, Americans dead. For what? The United States in the First World War was formally not even an allied country. It was called an associated country, because officially Wilson's view was the United States wasn't in the war to help Britain and France win. It was merely in the war. It was in the war merely to help end the war more quickly, if you can imagine something that bizarre. But that was the official view. But again, the disgust really at the British and the French refused to pay off the loans they had made after the end of the First World War, because they said, well, Mr. Wilson, well, you Americans, if the war was really fought for idealistic reasons, why do you want any money for it? It's only, you should just put it on the account of the sacrifice that already many young men had made with their lives, and asking for money debases the very cause that you claimed you were fighting for.
Americans in particular became aware of all the lies, all the scandals, all the waste, the useless death. And so they wanted normalcy, which they got in the 20s. And they had the Neutrality Acts passed in the 30s to keep America out of Europe's wars. That was the broad opinion. That was the majority opinion in the United States in the 1920s and 30s, was stay out of Europe's wars. That's what America was all about. So here we are in the mid to late 30s, and Dr. New Deal, FDR, is struggling to get out of the Depression. He doesn't seem to be able to do that by 37, 38. We're experiencing a depression within the depression, and along comes this crisis in Europe. Want to take it from there?
Well, right. This raises a real question of what motivated Franklin Roosevelt to betray his own pledges to the American public, to violate the Constitution, to break the law, to carry out a campaign of systematic deceit, to try to get the United States into war and to promote war in Europe. As I've written on other occasions, in other places, Franklin Roosevelt, even before war broke out in Europe in 1939, was giving secret and completely illegal pledges and pressure on Britain and France to try to go to war against Germany. What made him do this? What was the motive? Well, there are several reasons. A number of historians have stressed that this was a way of deflecting attention from his own failures as chief executive of the United States after he took office in 1933. His record in dealing with the number one crisis of America during that time, the unemployment and the economic downturn, the Great Depression, was a very poor one. In 1939, the unemployment rate in the United States was 15%. Now, that's after 6 years of administration by the Democratic Party. When he was, especially in the early years, he had virtually dictatorial powers. He had sweeping powers to do whatever he wanted. But Roosevelt was woefully ignorant about economics. He was astonishingly silly, really. I mean, just he hardly knew what he was doing. So all sorts of things were tried. Even contradictory programs were introduced, and things sort of got a little bit better from 1934, 35, and then came another recession. Came a recession in 1937. Things were again very bad. And this was especially galling in comparison with when compared with the record in Germany. Hitler and Roosevelt took office at almost exactly the same time and left office by death at almost exactly the same time in 1945. I mean, they were in office, chief executives of their countries for almost exactly the same span of time. But Roosevelt's record was, and they both came to office above all to deal, their primary mandate, their primary mission was to deal with the depression, with the great unemployment problem and the economic paralysis that had gripped both countries and, of course, the whole world at that time. But Roosevelt's record was a miserable one, whereas in Germany, as I've written on other occasions and other people have pointed out, Hitler was able, within 2 or 3 years, to basically eliminate unemployment in his country and to bring tremendous prosperity to Germany, to make German society even exemplary for many people in Europe and around the world. And now, again, I mean, was Roosevelt envious too? I mean, these are hard things to say, but certainly there are two factors I think that are indisputable. One, Roosevelt, like many other Americans of English patrician background, were very, very pro-English and hostile to Germany to start with. But another important factor, and this needs to be stressed much more than it usually is the already by that time the tremendous cultural influence that the Jewish community had in America. Jews overwhelmingly supported Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt was good for the American Jewish community. He put more Jews in his cabinet and his administration than any previous president. His main speechwriter was Jewish. It was just, of course, the Secretary of Treasury, Henry Morgenthau, was Jewish. He appointed Jews to the Supreme Court. Many people in lesser positions were, of course, Jewish. And the media in America, Jewish media, was, of course, very, very hostile to Hitler's Germany. The very existence of a modern country that said we don't need or want Jews was already a tremendous challenge or a blight for as far as American Jews saw it. So they supported and were very eager to support right from 1933 every possible measures against Hitler's Germany. So these are all some of the factors that played a role. But I think it's very important, and I try to stress this. There is an element in American society by people like Roosevelt, people like Wilson, and you'll find that it'd be George Bush, even Obama, that see America as this playing the role of a kind of Superman in the world, going out to beat bad guys. And this is the other side of America's view of itself as a good country. We're good people. Well, if Superman's a good guy, how does he prove it? Well, he's always fighting bad guys. And many Americans have this view. We see just time and time again American politicians and American media portraying some person in some other country as a new Hitler. He's out to get us, and we've got to go get him. Now, the results, of course, are often calamitous, disastrous, but this fits in with a very American idea of itself. You don't find people in Switzerland or Japan or Argentina or other countries feeling compelled to prove how good they are by always fighting so-called bad guys around the world. But this is something that is ingrained, I think, in the American character. I go into this in other things I've written. Now, it's not an essential point, trying to understand the motives. The fact is, though, that Franklin Roosevelt acted very systematically to try to foment war in Europe and to try to get America into the war in Europe. against the wishes of the American people and contrary to the Constitution and the law of the United States.
He took a series of measures both in Asia and Europe.
Yes.
Particularly after 1937, because I think he got the Flying Tigers going off in China.
Right. Yes. I mean, this is true, but as I think all historians are unanimous, is that his primary focus, of course, was on Europe. He was far less concerned with Asia than he was with getting that bad guy Hitler and going after Germany.
Yet it served as the backdoor to war, because it was through the Asia theater that he was able to, make Hitler take the bait and declare war on the United States in December 41 after Pearl Harbor.
Right. Well, I mean, already Roosevelt was carrying out actions that, well, as even a U.S. Navy secretary wrote or said at the time, Hitler had every justification in declaring war against the United States already by the summer of 1941. The United States was effectively already a military ally. It was giving military aid not only to Britain, but also to the Soviet Union, beginning in July 1941. I mean, the United States was by no stretch of the imagination acting in accord with international or American law as a so-called neutral country. It was belligerently on the side of the Soviet Union and Britain by the time Pearl Harbor happened.
Yeah, because it was Lend-Lease had been passed, and he also had violated neutrality acts prior to Lend-Lease being acted. He had committed crimes in pursuit of this policy.
These are all criminal. These are there's no question about it. Yeah. And you'll find people who defend Roosevelt by saying, well, he had to. Well, they'll say. One historian says he wasn't stayed by the niceties of international law. In other words, he ignored international law because he was acting according to a so-called higher law. Well, this is a very dangerous thing, because if you accept that premise that it was okay for Roosevelt to do it because he had a good moral purpose in mind, that's a green light for any American president to go to war if he can convince himself that he's doing it for some morally good-sounding reason. And that's one of the points I try to make in speeches I've given, lectures I've given, and in this essay that you cited earlier. This dangerous precedent that says, oh, it's okay to break the law. It's okay to deceive the American public. It's okay to lie if you're doing it for a good reason. This is the justification that politicians do all the time. They justify doing things that are underhanded or illegal because they say, well, I'm a good guy. I'm doing it for a good reason. This is extraordinarily dangerous especially to uphold it as somehow as a good thing.
Now, that argument was based on the idea that by 1941, Hitler, Nazi Germany, had plans for not only for continental supremacy, but for global supremacy. And that created a moral and strategic imperative for U.S. entry into that war in order to stop Hitler.
Yes, this is very important, that Roosevelt and the American media, much of the American media, repeated continually this idea that Hitler was out to take over the world. The Time magazine, Life magazine, ran these charts or maps showing how Hitler's legions were going to go down through Africa, down through West Africa. We're going to jump across the Pacific into Brazil and come up through Central America into the United States. And this was serious. This was meant seriously.
They couldn't get across the channel.
I mean, it's so absurd. It's astonishing. It really is insulting to the American public that people could believe whoppers of this magnitude. But in October 1941, in a speech that I've written a whole essay on, President Roosevelt spoke to the American public in a nationwide radio address that was given at a big meeting in Washington, D.C., in which he claimed that he had secret documents proving Hitler was going to take over the whole world. And when he did, he was going to abolish all of the world's religions, including Christianity and Buddhism and what he called Mohammedanism, Islam, and replace them with this religion of Hitlerism. This was so absurd. It's astonishing that the American public would believe this, but millions of Americans accepted this at its face. And of course, it was a lie. It was absolutely nonsense. I mean, the German government responded by saying it's so absurd, even to try to respond to it is just incredible. I mean, but he also claimed to have a secret map, which he did have a map. It was later shown to have been concocted by the British Secret Service, showing how Hitler was going to take over all of Latin America and divvy it up into new states that were going to be subordinate to Germany. This is so fantastic, you can hardly get your head around it. In October 1941, when Roosevelt was saying these things to the American people, German armies were fighting desperately in the winter, or beginning of winter of 1941, to take Moscow. Their major challenge at that time was in this do or die struggle against the Soviet Union, a struggle they eventually lost, by the way. They were unable even to, as you point out, to cross to even the English Channel. In fact, Hitler didn't even want war with Britain. He not only didn't want to take over the world, he didn't even want he didn't even want war in 1939 with Britain or France. The whole thing is fantastic, but Americans still have this, accept this kind of narrative, these basic lies, because to accept the alternative is very hard to credit. It means that one of the most revered presidents of modern times, Franklin Roosevelt, was a criminal, was liar. He broke his oath of office, and this is very hard for Americans to accept, because it means that not only the good war wasn't what it was presented to be, but that other wars based upon this image of America and this image of the Second World War is wrong. That's a very hard thing to do, because coming to grips with the Second World War and America's role in that war is, in a sense, to come to grips with our definition of ourself as a people, and the whole narrative of history that is that prevails in the United States. That history is moving in this direction. The whole world should be moving to be like the United States. You'll find echoes of this from president after president. George Bush expresses this. Barack Obama expresses this. Other American presidents since Roosevelt have expressed this view in one form or another, that the world is or should be like the United States. And if they're not, they just haven't quite gotten it yet, or we're going to cajole or press or push or force them to get with the program and be like the United States. Now, the United States could get away with that, as it were. It could do that for many years because U.S. power was so dominant in the world in the decades right after World War II. The United States after World War II was the only major industrial country that hadn't been destroyed in the war. So America's economic and financial and military power was just absolutely tremendous. Something like 90% of the automobiles of the world were made in 1947, 48, 49, were made by the big three automobile companies of Detroit. Now, the world is a very different one, and Americans still would like things to be the way they were in the 60s or the 50s. They're never going to go back to that, because the reality is just very, very different economically, militarily, financially than it was in those times.
Now, you mentioned Germany at war in 1939. Except the idea that Germany started the war, but as you mentioned, when Germany invaded Poland, it was over Danzig and the conflict with Poland and Danzig and the Danzig corridor and Poland's intransigence, which was aided by Britain's blank check, and which turns out was encouraged by FDR, by the Franklin Roosevelt administration, from what I understand. Right. But right. The key point is that France and Britain declared war on Germany. Germany did not
Right.
declare war.
Yeah,
So,
you'll often hear something, the way the narrative usually is presented is something like this. Well, Hitler attacked Poland in 1939. Then he attacked Denmark. Then he attacked France. Then he tried to take over Britain. Then he attacked the Soviet Union. And that's the way it's usually presented, without any context, without any understanding of what's really involved.
They show that map with the ink, right?
Yeah, they'll show that, and then they'll give this impression. They'll have pictures of German soldiers marching, and this impression that it's all part of this master plan, you see, to take over Europe and then take over the world. Mm-hmm. And it was presented that way. I mean, perhaps most graphically in a series of propaganda films made by the U.S. government called "Why We Fight," narrated by Walter Houston and made by. It was produced by the U.S. War Office and was obligatorily shown to American soldiers. It presents this very cartoon-like view of the origins of the war. Very simplistic one, very easy to digest, of course. But even in spite of that, many Americans during World War II were still not very up to speed about why they were fighting this war. You know, in 1943, Dwight Eisenhower and other American leaders were very concerned, for example, that Americans who were fighting in Italy didn't know exactly why they were there. And the Germans also, they would interrogate American prisoners of war and they'd say, well, why do you think you're here? And it was astonishing. I mean, the average American he thought, well, I don't know, it's something to do with Pearl Harbor or we're here. I mean, the Germans knew why they were fighting. They were fighting to defend their country. They didn't want to be taken over. But the Americans had a hard time. Many Americans didn't understand exactly why Americans were dying in Italy. The overwhelming mood. My father was in World War II. He's still alive. He said the overwhelming sense of most Americans who fought in the war was, well, it's a bad job and we just want to get it done and over with so we can go home and it'll all be behind us. Most Americans didn't even take seriously or credit or care very much about the big promises made by Roosevelt about how the world was going to be this new wonderful thing after the war. After the war was over, Roosevelt made these big, huge pledges and promises about what we were fighting for that turned out to be completely wrong, of course. But the average American didn't pay much attention to that. He just sort of thought, well, I guess we got to do it, and it's a hard job, it's an unpleasant thing. But and they just wanted to go back to life, just at home, back to normal again.
Now we have the issue of the war itself. Most Americans' understanding of World War II, they have gotten from movies, television. The few that do read about it, read books and magazine articles that support the official view, or the standard account, basically that America's entry was a moral and strategic imperative because the Third Reich was so uniquely evil. The Third Reich was seeking not only continental supremacy but also global supremacy. And in the course of waging that war, the Nazi government established a string of slave labor camps throughout Europe, occupied Europe, and many perished in those camps. A part of the reason for those camps, their function was not only just to support the German war effort, but the standard, I think, the Holocaust narrative holds that they were also there to carry out a genocidal program against Europe's Jews, the final solution to the Jewish question, if you will. This provided an ex post facto justification for America's entry into the war, because after all, a government so evil, carrying out something so evil, needed to be destroyed.
Those are all good points. Mm-hmm. And it is important to stress, too, a thing that you just mentioned, that a lot of that is ex post facto. Mm-hmm. We have, young people today, Americans today, hear a lot about the Holocaust. They hear, oh, Hitler was trying to kill all the Jews. That's a terrible thing. That's awful. That was not any kind of justification given during the war itself. If you ask, no American thought he was going over to land at D-Day in Normandy or bomb Germany because Jews are being killed. That wasn't even an issue until, in fact, the Holocaust story didn't even really play this big role in American cultural life in the media until the 1970s. If you look at American encyclopedias, World Book or Britannica, printed and published before 1980, there's no there's no entry for the Holocaust. It's not even an issue. The Holocaust, or what we now call the Holocaust, was kind of an issue during the Nuremberg trials after the war. But this is a post-war justification. In fact, a man who was the head of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Council, which runs the museum, we have this big museum in Washington, of course, devoted to the Holocaust. He said, well, it used to be that World War II was the foreground story and the Holocaust was the backstory. Now the Holocaust is the main story and World War II is the backstory. I mean, that's how amazingly transformed our view of that has become. Now, but again, yeah, I mean, at the time they were told Hitler's trying to take over, but what this required was a tremendous amount of amnesia. The most belligerent country at the time, and historians are fairly unanimous about this, the most oppressive major country in the world at that time, well, it wasn't Germany, it was the Soviet Union. The United States, the Soviet Union attacked Finland in fought a war in 1940 and was expelled from the League of Nations as a result. I mean, actually, the Soviet forces went into Poland in 1939 too. But Americans were basically supposed to forget about all that and just ignore the Soviet Union, which was America's most important military ally during the Second World War. In fact, the Soviet Union, Stalinist Russia, was the most important military ally, full stop, from the United States in its history, because World War II was the most important war, and the Soviet Union was by far the most important military ally of the United States in that conflict. But Americans like to forget about this, and it was especially forgotten about it because just a couple of years after the Second World War, the number one enemy was no more Germany; it was Stalinist Russia. Well, if Stalinist Russia was such a bad country, they should have thought of that in 1941, 42, not just in 1949.
Yeah, so basically we were told that the U.S. went to war to defend democracy, to defend freedom, but America's principal allies were the British Empire, which is highly democratic, and, as you say, the Soviet Union, which was, I think, hands down the world's worst tyranny, especially under Stalin at the time.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But you see, the American public was, pretty easily manipulated because even though Americans like to think of themselves as very shrewd and smart and so, but every people does, all people like to think of themselves that way. Because the United States is in North America and not in Europe or Asia, it's insulated from a lot of these great conflicts and really insulated from war. That's, I think, a very important point that I've tried to stress many times. For Americans, war is something that happens far, far away, except for the young men who were being shot or wounded or killed in the First and Second World Wars. Those two great conflicts were basically good times for America. That's a very different experience than France or Germany or Poland or Russia or Japan or China or other countries. For them, war means bombs, it means privation, it means tremendous suffering in a way that very few Americans can really conceive of. To just repeat, in World War I, it was the war brought economic boom to the United States, and World War II did the same thing. Jobs were then plentiful. Factories were roaring. Things were booming. Now, of course, it was bad for those people who actually got shot up and shot and killed and wounded and so forth. But apart from them, war was good. And that's, unfortunately, I think, part of the American experience. We don't have collectively the same sense of war that people in Italy or Poland, Germany, France, or other countries have had, especially in the 20th century.
Yeah. You can't imagine a movie taking place in Poland called The Summer of 42, right?
right. That's a good example. Yeah.
The home front, right? But I guess the Holocaust narrative and the atrocities that the Germans committed during the war justified many of the Allied atrocities, or at least at least it created the justification. We have to bomb, we have to destroy them because they're so evil. But very few Americans, they're aware of the bombing campaign, and they justify Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Tokyo, Hamburg, Dresden, of all places. So these things are justified in the context of war. But one thing not aware of is after the war, 45 through 50, some terrible things were done to German civilians. One thing was the removal of ethnic Germans from Eastern Europe, which killed about 3 million people, I believe, in about 5 years. But you have this thing with Eisenhower's death camps that James Bach writes about in his book, Crimes and Mercies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. I mean, all that was more or less, is simply more or less ignored by Americans. That's very true. Yeah.
It's overlooked. Yeah.
Well, with regard to the Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I think it's always worth remembering that the American Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb program, was designed to build this horrible weapon to be used not against Japan. It was designed to be used against Germany. It would have been used against Germany, except it wasn't in place. It wasn't ready to be used until after Germany had already surrendered. Mm-hmm. But the program began in 1939 with a letter from Albert Einstein to Franklin Roosevelt, which kicked off the Manhattan Project. But the whole point and purpose of the atomic bomb program was to drop these atomic bombs on Europe. That's why you'll find a lot of people say, America is such a racist country. They dropped the atomic bomb only on Asians. They didn't drop them on Europeans. Well, that wasn't due to any lack of wanting. It was merely that the war had already ended before the atomic bomb was available to be used or tested when Germany had already surrendered in May 1945. But yes, and of course afterward, and it's important to use this word terror. We hear a lot in America today about, we got to fight terrorism. Terrorism's really a terrible thing. Well, the U.S. Bombing campaign against Germany during World War II, and the British too, was a terror campaign. It's arguably the largest scale terror campaign in modern history, carried out on a worldwide scale against not only against Germany but against other countries as well. But Americans don't like to think of it like that. I mean, a war on terror is already a stupid thing, because terror is a tactic, not a thing in itself. It's like making a war on war. And time and again, countries or leaders who are considered terrorists at one time, if they win, if they're successful, then they're considered good guys eventually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you had this they call it strategic bombing, but
it was called area bombing.
Yeah, area bombing.
I mean, you'll find, of course, a lot of references to this on the IHR website and other sites that go into this in great detail. And of course, but again, this is something Americans would like to forget, because you're supposed to remember, when all is said and done, it doesn't matter how terrible the United States was, or how terrible what terrible things it might have done. After all, we're fighting Hitler, so it's okay. That's supposed to end all discussion, all arguments. And again, this is the central point. When you ask at the beginning of this session, what's the central point of talking about why is this idea of the good war bad? It's precisely because it becomes a pretext or an excuse for very, very harmful, bad policies in our time and in the future.
Yeah, and you said any recalcitrant foreign leader, they just pull out the marker and draw a Hitler mustache on him and say it's okay. Then justify the war, justify the bombing, and